We continue now at the top of Daf Samech Gimel Amud Aleph in Meseches Nazir. This is Nazir Daf 63a. The Mishnah says, Nazir Shagilach, let's say you have a Nazir who shaves, V'noda lo shu tamei. Then he finds out that he actually had become tamei. Im tumma yedua, if it is a known tumma, so then it undoes his Nazirus. He has to start the Nazirus count over again. V'im tumas tahom, now if it is a tumas tahom, a tumma of the depths, so in that case, Eino soser does not undo the count of his Nazirus. Imad shalo gilach, and the Mishnah says, if this happens before he actually shaves and completes his term of Nazirus, so bein kach uvein kach soser, then it doesn't actually matter. It doesn't matter if it's tumma yedua or tumas tahom, it is going to undo his count of Nazirus. And the Mishnah explains, Ketzad, how so? Yarad litvol b'ma'ara. Let's say he goes down to immerse himself in a cave. V'nimtza meis tzaf al piyam ma'ara. And he finds that there's a dead body that's floating at the mouth of the cave. That would be a case of tumah yedua. So then he's considered tamei, and then it is going to be soser. However, nimtza meshuka bekarka. Let's say he finds out later that the mace was buried deep in the ground, bekarka hamar, in the earth of the cave. So then it depends. Yarad lohaker. So if he goes down just to cool off, that's our case in the Mishnah where we say it's eino soser. So then tahar. So then he's going to be considered pure. However, litar mitumas mace. Let's say he went down into that. He went to immerse in order to purify himself from a different tumas mace. So then in that case, actually, we would be strict, and tamei we would say he's tamei. And the reason is shechezkas tamei, because when you have a situation of a person who has a presumption of already being tamei, and then he enters into this type of situation, so then we say he's tamei. V'chezkas tahor. However, if he's a person who has a chazaka that he's pure, so then we say he's pure sheraglayim ladavar, because it makes sense in that situation to say that he is tahor. And the Rush explains, Nazir shagilach hevi karbonosa v'gilach. The Rush says the case over here is the Nazir shaved, meaning to say he brought his karbonos at the conclusion of his term of his Nazirus, and he shaved. So im tumah yedua. So if it's a known tumah, what that means is perish tumah she'efsher shehaisa yedua. What it means is it was that a tumah that he could have known about. That's what we're talking about over here. Kagon shaloya kever hatahom soser. In other words, it wasn't a kever that was in the depths. So then soser, then it's going to undo his count of Nazirus, and he has to count the Nazirus again. But tumas hatahom, but let's say it's a tumah of the depths. Kedemefarish begemara, as the Gemara will explain, she'ein acher makira b'sof olam. It was something that nobody could have known about. So then afa pi shavadei tumasa, even though he's for sure tamei, it's not a question over here of it's a suffix whether he became tamei. He certainly came in contact with his tumah, but still the halacha is eino soser. Still the halacha is, again, if he's at the end of the term and he's already shaved, it doesn't undo his count of nazirus if it's tumas hatahom. The halacha he ben nazir. The Rosh explains that's a halacha l'moshe misinai by nazir. Imad shelo gilach ukvar hevi karbonosav. So then it said again, if all of this happened before he shaved and he already brought his karbonos, but it was before he shaved, so bein kach Tuma Yedua, Ubein Kach, Tumas Hatahom. It doesn't matter whether it's Tuma Yedua or Tumas Hatahom. Soser, it is going to force him to recount his Nazirus. The Had Gemiri, the Tumas Hatahom Lo Saser, because that which we learned, that Tumas Hatahom does not undo the count of Nazirus. Hainu Davka Hechadino Delo Achar Giluach. That's only if he found out after he shaved. That's the Rabbi Eliezer. According to Rabbi Eliezer, we follow the shaving. O Achar Karbonos of the Rabbanan. Actually, according to the Rabbanan, we would follow the point in time when he brings his Karbonos. Our Mishnah is following Giluach, is following shaving, like Rabbi Eliezer. And the Rush continues, Keitzad din tumas hatahom yarad litvol b'ma'ara. So what exactly is the case of tumas hatahom? If he goes again to immerse himself in a cave, mitumas sheretz, let's say for example he has tumas sheretz, he goes to immerse. V'nimtza kazayis min hameis saf al pnei hamayim. It turns out that he finds there's a kazayis of a dead body that's floating on the water. That's not tahom. That's right there in the public, so to speak. Safek ha'el olav, safek lo ha'el olav. Let's say it's a situation where he's not sure whether he created an oel over that tumah or not. So that the halacha would be tamei. He's tamei in that case. The safek tumah b'rishus hayachid sveiko tamei. That follows the general principle that if it's a safek tumah b'rishus hayachid, we assume he's tamei. V'im no the lo safek zeh. Let's say he finds out about this suffix, so imachar shagilach soser, if it's after the time that he shaved, it is still going to undo his nazirus. The hainu tumah yadua, that would be a situation of tumah yadua. V'afagav da'amrinan begemara suffix tumah tzafa tahora. Now, even though we say in the Gemara that by a suffix tumah that's floating, we generally say pure, and here the Rosh is saying it's tamei, so hainu suffix maga, that's talking about a situation of a suffix if you touch the tumah, aval suffix oel tamei, but if you have a situation of a suffix of tumas oel, we would say tamei. And again, that's a situation where it's not considered tumas hatom, and it does undo the nazirus. However, Meshuka Bekarka Mor, but if it turns out this Tumah that he finds out about was in the earth of the cave, but Malkam Shataval, in the area where he immersed, Ubevadai Nitzman, the Rosh says this talking even in a situation where we know he certainly was Tameh, but he just found out about it after. So Imno de lo Achar Shagilach, if he found out about this after he already shaved, Tahari is considered pure anyway. Ve'eno sozer, it doesn't undo his count of Nazirus. Dahainu Tomas Hatom. That is the case of Tomas Hatom. Uvareisha nakat litvol l'ribusa, and the Rush just points out, why are we talking about that he's going down to immerse? So that's just an added chiddush. Afagav datov mituma nizr mikol davar hamitami. The point is, even though generally speaking, a person who's going to immerse himself from some kind of tumah is very careful, still the halacha in that situation is we are strict, talking about a situation where it is not tumas hatahom. And the Mishnah continued, Litar mi tumas hameis. Now let's say he was going to immerse in order to purify himself from tumas meis. And the Rosh explains the case, Kagon Shay Nazir Tameh. For example, the case is, let's say he was a Nazir that was Tameh, V'taval b'ma'ara, and then he immersed in this cave, Shaya HaMeis Meshuka Ba, and then again, there was a mace that was buried in that area, that's Tumas HaTahom, V'hishlam Naziruso, and he completed his Nazirus, O Tameh Meis Shataval, or let's say at a case where he was a Tameh Meis, he immersed, V'yachakach Kibul Olav Nazirus, and then he accepted upon himself a Nazirus. So in that case, Tameh, we find out about this Tumah later on, he is considered Tameh. V'sozer, it's going to undo anything he counted, and the reason for that is Shechezkas Tameh, again, if there's a presumption of Tumah, we say Tameh, V'chezkas Tar, Shiraglaim L'Davar, and if there's a presumption of Tahara, then we say is pure, because of the Raglaim L'Davar, and the Rosh points out, Hai Raglaim L'Davar Lav Dafka, the term Raglaim L'Davar here is not an exact term to be used, Da'achi Gemiri Hilchas, so really this is just a Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, that we make this distinction between Chezkas Tameh and Chezkas Tar. El Kolomer, what the Mishnah just means to say is Ktsas Tam Yesh L'Davar, there is some svar, there's some logic to this idea, Kevin the V'chezkas Tomas Meis Lo Nitna halacha l'taro. Since he's in a chezkas tumas meis, so there the halacha l'Moshe Misinai does not say that he's going to be pure. And the Gemara says, Menohani Mili, from where do we know that when it comes to Tumas HaTahom, it does not undo the count of the Nazirus? Amar Rabbi Eliezer says, Diamar Kratz, because the Pasuk says, V'chiyomus meis olav b'pesa pisom, olav b'mechuveres lo. We understand the Pasuk, when it says the word olav, it means it has to be a Tumah that is clear to him, and when you have Tumas HaTahom, a Tumah that is in the depths, that's not considered clear, and therefore it's not going to undo the term of his Nazirus. Reish Lakish says, Amar Kratz, because the Pasuk says, Ki tamei l'nefesh, o b'derech rechoka. When it talks about being tamei meis, it talks about a derech rechoka. It uses the word derech, and therefore we say ki derech. We compare the tumah to a derech, to a road. Ma derech begolei, just like a road is something that is in the open. Af kol begolei. So too, the halacha only applies again where we say by a nazir that the tumah will be soser, and that he has to start over the nazirus count. That's only if the tumah is out in the open. And so the Gemara says, V'yalaha Tanya, but what about that which we learned in the following brisa? Ezui tumas hatahom, what is considered to be tumas hatahom? Kol she'eno makira echad besofa olam. It means it's a kind of tumah that nobody, not one person in the world, recognized that this tumah was around. Aval makira echad besofa olam, but if one person would be able to have recognized this tumah, ein zu tumas hatahom. That's not called tumas hatahom. And so the Gemara says, B'shalom alaman damar ki derech shaper. I understand if you're learning it out from the word derech, from the road, that makes sense, because if you have even one person that's able to recognize it, that's not considered anymore like the tumas hatahom, that's already like a derech. But according to the one who says that we learn out from the pasuk, it has to be mechuveres lo, something that was clear to him. So ki makira echad b'sofa olam, I have it. Just because one person recognized that tumah, maybe it still isn't clear to him. Why is that enough to make it that it's not considered like tumas hatahom? Vesu, and further hadatanya, that which we learned in a brisa, hamotzi meis mushkov l'rechava shel derech. Let's say a person finds a mace and he's lying across the width of the road, meaning he realizes that he must have become tameh because he crossed the road where there was tumah. But again, this was a situation of tumas hatahom. So the brisa makes the following distinction. But truma tameh, when it comes to issues of truma, so we rule stringently and we say the individual is tameh. But benazir uvasiyas pesach, when it comes to the issue of nazir, when it comes to the issue of karban pesach, let's say he did karban pesach and then he finds out he had the situation of tumah. So with regards to those issues, tahar, then we say he is pure. And so the Gemara asks, if you're going to say we learn it out from a pasuk, Maishna, why should we make such a distinction between these various halachas? If it's learned from a pasuk, we shouldn't make such distinctions. And so the Gemara answers, Ella, rather, Tumas hatahom. You have to say it's not really learned from a pasuk. These are not the correct sources. Rather, this halacha of Tumas hatahom, Gemara Gemiri law, is simply a halacha. It's a tradition, halacha l'Moshe Misinai. It does not come from a pasuk. And the Rosh explains, the truth is, they could have asked the same question from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah also makes certain distinctions that can't be explained from the psukim. Our Mishnah makes a distinction between finding out the tumah after shaving and finding out before shaving. If you're going to learn it from the pasuk, you really don't have a reason to make these distinctions. Also, the end of the Mishnah makes distinctions that if he's immersing in order to purify himself, so then he's tamei. But if you're learning from a pasuk, if we know for sure that he was tamei from kever home, what difference does it make what his status was, that he was tamei before, was it or wasn't tamei? Since we're talking about a situation where he had tumas meis yedua, he had known tumas meis, and he had immersed and become tar. So what difference does that make? And so therefore you have to say the distinctions can only be explained tumas hatahom gemara gemiri law, that it is a tradition. It's halacha l'Moshe misinai ukroi demaisi leil asmachta bi'almaninu, and the psukim we're bringing that's just an asmachta for this halacha. V'dafka l'nazir v'yosa pesach gemiri, and this tradition, this halacha l'Moshe misinai, was only learned with regards to nazir and carbon pesach. We're not saying he's tar completely. We're saying that tumas hatom is tar with regards to these specific halachas. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, the Mishnah made a distinction between whether he found out about the tumah before he shaved or after he shaved. And the Gemara says, Man Tana, so who's the Tana of our Mishnah? Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Eliezer. The Tana of our Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer. The Yomar Tiglachas me'akeves. Rabbi Eliezer holds that it's the shaving that is required in order to allow the Nazir to be permitted in wine, and in order for the Naziris to no longer be binding. And so therefore you see in our Mishnah as well, we're saying that it goes by the shaving, it does not go by the bringing of the karbonos. And the Gemara continues, Boy Rami Bar Chama asks the following question, Nitma besoch malos, let's say the individual, the Nazir, becomes tamei during his term of Nazirus, v'no delo la'achar malos, and then he only finds out after his term is over, so mahu, what's the halacha? Basar Yediya Azlinan, do we follow when he found out about the Tumah? V'Yediya Achar Melosi, and the finding out is after the term. Olo or no, do we really go by when the Tumah actually was? And the Gemara says, well, Lamayan, for what practical halacha are you asking this question? Lamistra, we're asking this question in terms of the halachas of undoing the term of the Naziris, because we know that if you have Tumah Achar Melos, so we're more lenient if you find out after the term is over, or we're more lenient if you become Tameh rather after the term is over, and we say it doesn't undo the entire Naziris according to Rabbi Eliezer, it only adds an additional 7 days. And Tosas explained, Boy Rami Bar Chama Nitma Toch Malos. Rami Bar Chama asks, if the person becomes Tameh, the Nazir becomes Tameh during the term of the Nazirus, but Tumah Yedua, this could be a question by Tumah Yedua, but Tumah Satahom, V'no Delo La'achar Malos, Kodem Giluach, or you could ask the same question, let's say it's Tumah Satahom, but he finds out after the term is completed, but before the actual shaving. So the question is again, is this considered Tumah at the end of the term, or during the term? Rebbe Lazar, according to Rebbe Lazar, Ma, what's the halacha? Basar Tumah Azlinan V'soser Shloshim, do we follow the time of the Tumah, and therefore would undo the Nazirus, he'd have to keep an additional 30 days. Or Basar Yediyah Azlinan, do we go by the time he found out, which was after the term, and according to Rabbi Eliezer V'soser Shiva, it would only undo 7 days. And the Mefarshim do point out that the Mishnah seems to say explicitly that we follow the time of the actual Tumah, because the Mishnah says Soser, which presumably means 30 days, and that is a difficulty that is dealt with by the Mefarshim. We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Gimel Amud Beis.